Personal liberty laws. In U.S. history, pre-Civil War laws passed by northern state governments to counteract the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Acts and to protect escaped slaves and free blacks settled in the North. Contravening the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which did not provide for trial by jury, Indiana 1824 and Connecticut 1828 enacted laws making jury trials for escaped slaves possible upon appeal. In 1840 Vermont and New York granted fugitives the right of jury trial and provided them with attorneys. After 1842, when the U.S. The Supreme Court ruled that enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act was a federal function, some northern state governments passed laws forbidding state authorities to cooperate in the capture and return of fugitives. In the reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act contained in the Compromise of 1850, most northern states provided further guarantees of jury trial, authorized severe punishment for illegal seizure and perjury against alleged fugitives, and forbade state authorities to recognize claims to fugitives. These laws were among the many assaults on states' rights cited as a justification for secession by South Carolina in 1860. Underground Railroad. In the United States, a system existing in the northern states before the Civil War by which escaped slaves from the South were secretly helped by sympathetic Northerners, in defiance of the Fugitive Slave Acts, to reach places of safety in the North or in Canada. Though neither underground nor a railroad, it was thus named because its activities had to be carried out in secret, using darkness or disguise, and because railway terms were used in reference to the conduct of the system. Various routes were lines, stopping places were called stations, those who aided along the way were conductors, and their charges were known as packages or freight. The network of routes extended in all directions throughout 14 northern states and the Promised Land of Canada, which was beyond the reach of fugitive slave hunters. Those who most actively assisted slaves to escape by way of the railroad were members of the free black community, including such former slaves as Harriet Tubman, Northern abolitionists, philanthropists, and such church leaders as Quaker Thomas Garrett. Harriet Beecher Stowe, famous for her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, gained first-hand knowledge of fugitive slaves through her contact with the Underground Railroad in Cincinnati, Ohio. Estimates of the number of black people who reached freedom vary greatly, from 40,000 to 100,000. Although only a small minority of Northerners participated in the Underground Railroad, its existence did much to arouse Northern sympathy for the lot of the slave in the antebellum period, at the same time convincing many Southerners that the North as a whole would never peaceably allow the institution of slavery to remain unchallenged. Slave Code. In U.S. history, any of the set of rules based on the concept that enslaved persons were property, not persons. Inherent in the institution of slavery were certain social controls, which enslaved amplified with laws to protect not only the property but also the property owner from the danger of slave violence. The slave codes were forerunners of the black codes of the mid-19th century. Slave rebellions were not unknown, and the possibility of uprisings was a constant source of anxiety in the American colonies and, later, in the U.S. states with large slave populations. In Virginia during 1780 to 1864, some 1,418 slaves were convicted of crimes. 91 of the convictions were for insurrection and 346 for murder. Enslaved persons also ran away. In the British possessions in the New World, the settlers were free to promulgate any regulations they saw fit to govern their labor supply. As early as the 17th century, a set of rules was in effect in Virginia and elsewhere, but the slave codes were constantly being altered to adapt to new needs, and they varied from one colony and, later, one state to another. All the slave codes, however, had certain provisions in common. In all of them the color line was firmly drawn, and any amount of African heritage established the race of a person as black, with little regard as to whether the person was slave or free. The status of the offspring followed that of the mother, so that the child of a free father and an enslaved mother was a slave. This provision is reflected in a Virginia slave code from December 1662. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly, that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. Slaves had few legal rights. In court their testimony was inadmissible in any litigation involving whites. They could make no contract, nor could they own property. Even if attacked, they could not strike a white person. There were numerous restrictions to enforce social control. Slaves could not be away from their owner's premises without permission. They could not assemble unless a white person was present. They could not own firearms. They could not be taught to read or write, nor could they transmit or possess inflammatory literature. They were not permitted to marry. Obedience to the slave codes was exacted in a variety of ways. Such punishments as whipping, branding, and imprisonment were commonly used. Some enslaved persons, especially those who committed violence against whites, were killed, although slaves' value to their owners as labor discouraged the practice. A Virginia slave code from October 1669 addressed the killing of slaves this way. Whereas the only law in force for the punishment of refractory servants resisting their master, mistress, or overseer cannot be inflicted upon Negroes, nor the obstinacy of many of them be suppressed by other than violent means, be it enacted and declared by this grand assembly if any slave resists his master or other by his master's order correcting him and by the extremity of the correction should chance to die, that his death shall not be accounted a felony, but the master or that other person appointed by the master to punish him be acquitted from molestation, since it cannot be presumed that premeditated malice which alone makes murder a felony should induce any man to destroy his own estate. Slave codes were not always strictly enforced, but, whenever any signs of unrest were detected, the appropriate machinery of the state would be alerted and the laws more strictly enforced. Reconstruction. In U.S. history, the period 1865 to 1877 that followed the American Civil War and during which attempts were made to redress the inequities of slavery and its political, social, and economic legacy and to solve the problems arising from the readmission to the Union of the 11 states that had seceded at or before the outbreak of war. Long portrayed by many historians as a time when vindictive radical Republicans fastened black supremacy upon the defeated Confederacy, Reconstruction has since the late 20th century been viewed more sympathetically as a laudable experiment in interracial democracy. Reconstruction witnessed far-reaching changes in America's political life. At the national level, new laws and constitutional amendments permanently altered the federal system and the definition of American citizenship. In the South, a politically mobilized black community joined with white allies to bring the Republican Party to power, and with it a redefinition of the responsibilities of government. The national debate over Reconstruction began during the Civil War. In December 1863, less than a year after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Pres. Abraham Lincoln announced the first comprehensive program for Reconstruction, the 10% Plan. Under it, when 1/10 of a state's pre-war voters took an oath of loyalty, they could establish a new state government. To Lincoln, the plan was an attempt to weaken the Confederacy rather than a blueprint for the post-war South. It was put into operation in parts of the Union-occupied Confederacy, but none of the new governments achieved broad local support. In 1864 Congress enacted and Lincoln pocket vetoed the Wade-Davis Bill, which proposed to delay the formation of new Southern governments until a majority of voters had taken a loyalty oath. Some Republicans were already convinced that equal rights for the former slaves had to accompany the South's readmission to the Union. In his last speech, on April 11, 1865, Lincoln, referring to Reconstruction in Louisiana, expressed the view that some blacks, the very intelligent, and those who had served in the Union Army ought to enjoy the right to vote. Following Lincoln's assassination in April 1865, Andrew Johnson became president and inaugurated the period of presidential Reconstruction 1865 to 1867. Johnson offered a pardon to all Southern whites except Confederate leaders and wealthy planters, although most of these subsequently received individual pardons, restoring their political rights and all property except slaves. He also outlined how new state governments would be created. Apart from the requirement that they abolish slavery, repudiate secession, and abrogate the Confederate debt, these governments were granted a free hand in managing their affairs. They responded by enacting the Black Codes, laws that required African Americans to sign yearly labor contracts and in other ways sought to limit the freedmen's economic options and re-establish plantation discipline. African Americans strongly resisted the implementation of these measures, and they seriously undermined Northern support for Johnson's policies. When Congress assembled in December 1865, radical Republicans such as Republican Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania and Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts called for the establishment of new Southern governments based on equality before the law and universal male suffrage. But the more numerous moderate Republicans hoped to work with Johnson while modifying his program. Congress refused to seat the representatives and senators elected from the Southern states and in early 1866 passed the Freedmen's Bureau and Civil Rights Bills. The first extended the life of an agency Congress had created in 1865 to oversee the transition from slavery to freedom. The second defined all persons born in the United States as national citizens, who were to enjoy equality before the law. A combination of personal stubbornness, fervent belief in states' rights, and racist convictions led Johnson to reject these bills, causing a permanent rupture between himself and Congress. The Civil Rights Act became the first significant legislation in American history to become law over a president's veto. Shortly thereafter, Congress approved the 14th Amendment, which put the principle of birthright citizenship into the Constitution and forbade states to deprive any citizen of the equal protection of the laws. Arguably the most important addition to the Constitution other than the Bill of Rights, the amendment constituted a profound change in federal-state relations. Traditionally, citizens' rights had been delineated and protected by the states. Thereafter, the federal government would guarantee all Americans equality before the law. Against state violation. In the fall 1866 congressional elections, Northern voters overwhelmingly repudiated Johnson's policies. Congress decided to begin Reconstruction anew. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 divided the South into 5 military districts and outlined how new governments, based on manhood suffrage without regard to race, were to be established. Thus began the period of radical or congressional Reconstruction, which lasted until the end of the last Southern Republican government in 1877. By 1870 all the former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union, and nearly all were controlled by the Republican Party. 3 groups made up Southern Republicanism. Carpetbaggers, or recent arrivals from the North, were former Union soldiers, teachers, Freedmen's Bureau agents, and businessmen. The second large group, Scalawags, or native-born white Republicans, included some businessmen and planters, but most were non-slave-holding small farmers from the Southern upcountry. Loyal to the Union during the Civil War, they saw the Republican Party as a means of keeping Confederates from regaining power in the South. In every state, African Americans formed the overwhelming majority of Southern Republican voters. From the beginning of Reconstruction, black conventions and newspapers throughout the South had called for the extension of full civil and political rights to African Americans. Composed of those who had been free before the Civil War plus slave ministers, artisans, and Civil War veterans, the black political leadership pressed for the elimination of the racial caste system and the economic uplifting of the former slaves. 16 African Americans served in Congress during Reconstruction, including Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce in the U.S. Senate, more than 600 in state legislatures, and hundreds more in local offices from sheriff to justice of the peace scattered across the South. So-called black supremacy never existed, but the advent of African Americans in positions of political power marked a dramatic break with the country's traditions and aroused bitter hostility from Reconstruction's opponents. Serving an expanded citizenry, Reconstruction governments established the South's first state-funded public school systems, sought to strengthen the bargaining power of plantation laborers, made taxation more equitable, and outlawed racial discrimination in public transportation and accommodations. They also offered lavish aid to railroads and other enterprises in the hope of creating a New South, whose economic expansion would benefit blacks and whites alike. But the economic program spawned corruption and rising taxes, alienating increasing numbers of white voters. Meanwhile, the social and economic transformation of the South proceeded apace. To blacks, freedom meant independence from white control. Reconstruction provided the opportunity for African Americans to solidify their family ties and to create independent religious institutions, which became centers of community life that survived long after Reconstruction ended. The former slaves also demanded economic independence. Blacks' hopes that the federal government would provide them with land had been raised by General William T. Sherman's Field Order No. 15 of January 1865, which set aside a large swath of land along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia for the exclusive settlement of black families, and by the Freedmen's Bureau Act of March, which authorized the Bureau to rent or sell land in its possession to former slaves. But President Johnson in the summer of 1865 ordered land in federal hands to be returned to its former owners. The dream of 40 acres and a mule was stillborn. Lacking land, most former slaves had little economic alternative other than resuming work on plantations owned by whites. Some worked for wages, others as sharecroppers, who divided the crop with the owner at the end of the year. Neither status offered much hope for economic mobility. For decades, most Southern blacks remained propertyless and poor. Nonetheless, the political revolution of Reconstruction spawned increasingly violent opposition from white Southerners. White supremacist organizations that committed terrorist acts, such as the Ku Klux Klan, targeted local Republican leaders for beatings or assassination. African Americans who asserted their rights in dealings with white employers, teachers, ministers, and others seeking to assist the former slaves also became targets. At Colfax, Louisiana, in 1873, scores of black militiamen were killed after surrendering to armed whites intent on seizing control of the local government. Increasingly, the new Southern governments looked to Washington, D.C., for assistance. By 1869, the Republican Party was firmly in control of all three branches of the federal government. After attempting to remove Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, in violation of the New Tenure of Office Act, Johnson had been impeached by the House of Representatives in 1868. Although the Senate, by a single vote, failed to remove him from office, Johnson's power to obstruct the course of Reconstruction was gone. Republican Ulysses S. Grant was elected president that fall. Soon afterward, Congress approved the 15th Amendment, prohibiting states from restricting the right to vote because of race. Then it enacted a series of enforcement acts authorizing national action to suppress political violence. In 1871, the administration launched a legal and military offensive that destroyed the Klan. Grant was re-elected in 1872 in the most peaceful election of the period.